They lied to the immigration office saying I had abandoned my niece so they could take the house. But they never expected me to build a life that would make them beg for the same mercy they denied us when the van pulled away from the little bungalow on Willow Crescent. The house looked smaller than it had in my memory. It had once felt like the center of the world. My mother's voice humming through the kitchen. The way sunlight spilled across the narrow garden in the afternoon. The rhythm of a life stitched together by small, stubborn rituals. The house had been the place where I learned how to braid hair with 2 hands. Where I watched my mother patch leaky roofs and mend other people's lives with the same thread. It was supposed to be our anchor. Instead, when I was 26 and still clinging to the edges of certainty, that anchor became the leverage others used to pull me under. I had packed a single suitcase in a small, folded bundle of my niece's clothes. An official from social services had sat across from me in a windowless room and said the words. That felt like knives. That given the evidence and the paperwork, guardianship would be temporary, and unless I could prove stable residence and employment within 30 days, the arrangement might be reconsidered. I did not have 30 days. I had 30 hours before my sister left the country, a cheap one-way ticket, and a family meeting where they had decided that my absence was better than a scandal. They told the social worker that I had vanished, that I had been unreliable for years, that my drinking had made me unable to care for a child. My sister handed an old alcohol rehab brochure to the man as if it were a receipt. They convinced themselves and leaned on the idea long enough that they believed it. My sister kept the bungalow. My parents said nothing, their silence a currency that could buy them distance. They called it pragmatism. My neighbors called it unfortunate. The truth was simpler and uglier. I had been poor in a family that did not forgive poverty. For months, I slept on couches and in staff rooms, waking before dawn to the heavy chill of hospital corridors. I took night shifts, doubled shifts, every spare hour scavenging for money, because my niece, small and glorious and stubborn in the way only children can be, had nothing but us. At first, she thought we moved a lot because I was playing a game. She would line up her stuffed animals and stage miniature rescues. But she asked, innocently, why we never stayed more than 2 nights anywhere. Once, crouched under a single blanket in a car park because the shelter was full, she pressed her forehead to mine and said it plainly. Why do other kids have beds and we sleep in the van? That question is what keeps grief fresh. It is a splinter that refuses to dissolve. When I finally found a room above a bakery and a job that allowed me to sleep on alternate nights, paperwork became the great enemy. The social worker wanted a steady address, a steady income, and a guarantee that I could keep my niece safe. I put together hand-me-down furniture, receipts from the bakery, and a letter from my supervisor. I took my niece to the doctor for vaccinations and to the library to prove routines. I filled every bureaucratic box like a litany, because each line was a promise. I would not let her slip into the hands of those who had sat and counted their reputations before our faces. The hearing date came after months of build-up. We arrived early, the courthouse a concrete shrug of a building that smelled of old coffee and paperwork. I remember the way my hands shook when I passed the clerk my folder. How my niece gripped a chipped plastic dinosaur and refused to let go. The judge listened, his face a neutral plane. My sister's lawyer spoke first. She painted a portrait of responsible family members who had simply offered temporary guardianship when their sister's life had become unstable. He said that moving in with relatives would be in the child's best interests. My stomach hollowed at the obsessive politeness of their words. Then the social worker asked the question that cleaved the room open. Had there been any allegations of abandonment? My sister said yes. She said I had left months ago, had not attended the child's appointments, had been hard to contact. She used the language of concern and formal distance. She had, in the weeks leading to the hearing, provided a small pile of email threads, some text messages, and a pair of photos taken at a birthday party that my niece had attended while I was working a graveyard shift at the hospital. None of it showed the nights I had spent awake in clinic waiting rooms, deputized by nurses to watch sleeping infants while exhausted mothers took an hour to breathe. None of it showed the times I had left to take my niece to daycare because the shelter forbade overnight guests. Documentable life is cruel. It records only what can be captured in pixels and stamps. It does not honor the quiet sacrifices. The judge's voice was softer when he ruled temporary guardianship be affirmed and that we would have to present a new hearing within 8 weeks. I left the courthouse with a document that was both victory and a tether. My sister smiled like it meant she had won something entirely other than custody. If I had been a different person, I would have taken that victory and used it to breathe. Instead, the room that evening felt smaller than the one I had at 26. A week later, I received a certified letter, an eviction notice from the owner of the bungalow. My sister had signed it, claiming abandonment, because the owner's name on the deed was recorded in my mother's name years ago. They produced a forged signature from a power of attorney claim. They filed papers with the city and, by a technicality, were granted temporary control of the property. The city inspectors came and declared the house unsafe for habitation because of a leaking roof. That had been there for years. The house that had once sheltering warmth was suddenly ineligible to be our address. The legal tangle stretched like a spiderweb. Lawyers cost money, and money evaporated because we had to pay rent on a room above a bakery and fees for repeating appointments. Every time I moved forward in paperwork, another document slid in, undermining my proof, and yet I clung to an eventuality I had named like a prayer. Karma, not as a cosmic lie about justice but as a stubborn faith in people's patterns. People are their habits, their choices. Those who raise a hand at others usually find their fingers cramped. I began to plan, but not the melodramatic revenge of the novels. My plan was granular, patient, the kind you build when you have nothing but time and a fierce, unspoiled need to make the truth visible. I worked more shifts and saved every tip. I took extra online courses in auditing and bookkeeping offered by the hospital's continuing ed fund. I learned how to read property records and municipal filings, how liens appear and vanish. I found ways to make the paperwork sing, what I didn't have, and what my sister and her new husband, a man who loved the idea of success more than the reality of it, thought I lacked, was the stomach to tie the legal strings. They underestimated me because they had spent their lives under the shelter of privilege. My sister had developed a habit of turning people into stories that never included her own errors. She spoke of me in the past tense at family gatherings, as if that ritual had sealed our fate. When I showed up at the bungalow occasionally, under the benign pretext of retrieving a box of winter clothes, she waved me off with that carefully curated pity that is cruelty in a different dress. Her husband called me a liability with a smile that made the word sharp. I learned to be quiet. I learned to be methodical. Nights that could have been consumed with anger were converted into spreadsheets. I built a timeline of ownership transfers, of tax payments, of when the property had been vacated for repairs that never materialized. I scoured the municipal registry and found the maintenance complaints that had been submitted anonymously by whoever had an interest in barring official access. There was an unspooling pattern. The bungalow had a history of being used as a bargaining chip, a place to be controlled. The more I dug, the more people surfaced who had been wronged by the same family in different ways. Vendors who had never been paid, neighbors with stories of sudden cut-off utilities, a small contractor who swore he'd been promised payment in cash that never came. Opportunity, I learned, often hides in the paperwork of the careless. The pivot came at a funeral, not ours. Mine had been years before. A slow unraveling of a life lost to illness. But a neighbor's funeral I attended because the woman had once lent me a ladder. There, in the chapel, I overheard a conversation between a municipal clerk and a contractor about the urban renewal plan. Ratified by the city council, a new transit development was being built 3 blocks away. Property values were slated to spike. The bungalow on Willow Crescent was in a zone that would be rezoned for multi-use. If development plans were approved, the owner of the property would be in a position to receive a handsome compensation. My sister's husband had been boasting about knowing people who could get the right permit for the right price a month ago. I felt my pulse spike in a new way. It was not greed, it was the feeling of leverage clicking into place. I rented a tiny office across from a public records office and spent days mapping the chain of title. I took what spare time I had at the bakery and turned it into a consultancy, offering to help small vendors file their tax returns and manage accounts. With every file I touched, my confidence grew. Then I found a glaring omission. The transfer the family claimed had executed power of attorney for my mother had been processed. With a misfiled notarization, the signature on the deed did not match the archived signature on the mother's previous tax documents. In a city of automated processes, human error left a soft seam where a sharp mind could cut. It was not only incompetence, it was arrogance. I filed a quiet challenge through a pro bono legal clinic. The paper trail I had assembled was a map of inconsistencies. I found the contractor who had been promised cash and never paid, and he agreed to swear under oath that he had never been contacted by my sister. I obtained a statement from a former neighbor who had seen my mother sign paperwork months before. The alleged power of attorney. It was slow, tedious, and exhausting. It involved late nights, dried out coffee, long bus rides, and the unglamorous work of being patient. But patience, I had learned, could wear down the well-armored lies of people who had practiced deceit like a religion. The first coup came not in court but at a meeting of the Homeowners Association. My sister's husband had been elected to a position of influence because he had whispered about urban development deals and handed out promises. He used the meeting to announce that he'd be meeting with potential developers and that he had a plan to modernize the block. He spoke with the lazy confidence of someone who had already decided on the outcome. The neighbors applauded politely. I had prepared a packet and slid it under the president's door. Copies of the original deed, photographs of my mother's faded signature on an old rent receipt, the contractor's affidavit. The president read it and asked me, politely, to explain. I stood up and spoke, not with rage but with a ledger-like clarity, about legal ownership, about neighbors' rights, about the ways in which decisions made by a few could affect the entire block. I told them about a woman's garden that had been a refuge for generations. I told them, equivocally, that I would not watch it be excised under something that looked like progress but smelled like profit. They listened because the truth reframes the room. Momentum shifted after that meeting. The association sent a formal complaint to the city. The city inspector revisited the bungalow and this time found that some of the unsafe citations had been incorrectly noted. When inspectors checked the notarization logs, the misfiled entry flagged an anomaly. My sister called, frantic, begging me to drop the challenge. She said our mother was ill, that everything had been a mistake. I listened to her voice, the real person, not the polished posture, and for a moment, my resolve cracked. What people perceive as revenge is often the slow justice of systems correcting a deliberate wrong. But there was also a personal marrow to this. My sister had not just taken a house. She had tried to take my niece, to erase our bonds for the comfort of her own choices. That was not something I could accept with a stiffened smile. I did not relish the harm I was causing. Each affidavit and each subpoena felt like a fracture widening in our family. At night, when I closed my eyes, I could still see my mother's hands, calloused, warm, teaching me to wash rice without wasting a grain. I wondered how she would have viewed the legal war one waged. Would she have wanted the house reclaimed if the cost was a family split so large it could not be bridged? I thought of my niece, asleep in a bed now in a small room above a bakery. And I thought of justice as a necessity for growth rather than vindictiveness. Court hearings are not gladiatorial. They are arithmetic of precedent, a patience game. The court called witnesses and documents. My sister's marriage cracked under scrutiny as records contradicted oral statements. The contractor swore he had been visited by a man I'd only ever seen infrequently at family parties. The man shifted his story when confronted with evidence. An investigator found that some of the power of attorney stamps had been created by the same small notarization agency that had also processed other fraudulent transfers in the past year. It turned out my sister's husband had been on a list of debt collectors. His promises of getting things done were two-sided risks. When the judge finally announced that the power of attorney transfer was invalid and ordered a reversion of title pending a forensic signature verification, my sister's face, captured in the gallery, was simultaneously crestfallen and furious. I felt nothing like triumph. Instead, there was a hollow exhale, like the moment after inhaling smoke. We were not yet whole, but we had the house back, legally at least. What followed was the most unexpected lesson. Walking into the bungalow felt like stepping into a memory that had been left overnight. The wallpaper peeled in the same place my mother used to hang a calendar. The garden had been let go to bramble and vine. My niece ran to the swings, the old squeaky frame groaning as if recognizing her. For the first time in years, nights felt like something I could own. But victory, once tasted, had an aftertaste of complexity. My sister did not go quietly. She appealed, filed countersuits, accused me of coercion. The family fracturing widened as relatives took sides. Old alliances were rerouted around whispered resentments. The legal battles drained me in ways money could not repair. I took to sleeping in the bungalow with the small fitness of a sentry. Alternate nights awake to keep watch while my niece slept, answering late night calls from the hospital, and juggling the paperwork that felt like a second job. Then came the real pivot. The developers proposed an offer to buy out the block to create a commercial corridor. My sister's husband floated the idea of selling to them, making a profit that would make the past year's struggle seem petty. They expected me to be naive, to be grateful for any settlement. They imagined I would blink and trade the garden for a check. I surprised them. I made a counter that was not about money. I demanded guarantees, contracts that would ensure that the block's long-term residents would get priority for any rehousing in case of redevelopment, that the city's Affordable Housing Commission would have oversight, that the community garden would be preserved. My sister's husband laughed at my demands and called me idealistic. It is easy to underestimate the power of leverage when one believes money is the only measure of power. I had, however, learned to wield a different kind. Moral jurisdiction. I had documentation. I had neighbors who trusted me. I had a story that could make developers look like predators. In meetings with developers, when spreadsheets were unfurled and numbers were proposed, I brought the voice of the block. The gardener who had planted the pear tree 30 years ago. The seamstress who taught children how to stitch. The elderly man who remembered when the street had a bakery on every corner. I told them that their profit would come at a visible civic cost. To their credit, one of the developers, an unassuming woman in a linen jacket, listened. She had grown up in a neighborhood that had been raised in the name of progress and had watched Families vanish. She offered a compromise that stunned everyone. They would set aside a parcel of land for a community hub, fund the relocation of residents at market rates with a priority clause, and provide educational grants to children displaced by redevelopment. In return, they wanted a quick title transfer and legal assurances. My sister screamed betrayal. She called me selfish for not taking the largest immediate offer. I signed the agreement for the community because I believed in a value that outpaced the instant cash. The developer kept her promises. Community meeting rooms were built, the garden was transformed into a public orchard, and low-income housing units were included in the development plan. Small, practical victories that did not erase pain but distributed it less cruelly. The legal war cooled into a weary truce. My sister packed up and left the country with the husband who had hoped to cash in. She emailed rarely, sometimes a line that read like a proposal for reconciliation. I read them and then filed them in a drawer, not because I was vindictive but because I had learned that some bridges, once burned, do not make good gestures. My parents drifted in and out of contact with the same polite distance as before. In the quiet that followed, something unexpected happened. The bungalow, restored gradually through community effort and the modest proceeds from token sales, became more alive than it had been when my family owned it alone. Children played in the converted backyard. The seamstress opened a small workshop where she taught mending and tailoring. The developer's educational program sponsored a scholarship that my niece, now older and sharper, used to attend science camps. It was messy and imperfect. Not everything could be fixed with contracts. Not every hurt could be healed with community gardens. I suppose the revenge some people expect from me, something dramatic and punitive, never manifested because it was never what I wanted. My aim had been simpler, to make sure my niece had roots, that our story would not be smudged into non-existence by the convenient narratives of those who prefer to rewrite the past to suit themselves. I wanted to reclaim the right to remember and to build. That, in its own way, looked like victory. The final twist came years later, when I visited a municipal meeting about the naming of a new pedestrian lane. Developers, city planners, and residents negotiated the last details. My sister's husband had moved into a small condo nearby. He was present, awkward and unfamiliar with the way the room smelled of old coffee. He spoke briefly and then left. On a whim, someone suggested naming the lane after a long-forgotten neighborhood activist whose reputation had been erased in municipal records. The room turned toward me because I had become a visible steward of the block. I rose and suggested a different name, the name of the woman who had taught my mother to sew, who had fed countless children, who had been a neighbor and a keeper of secrets. Her name was not famous. It mattered because she had been real. When the council voted, the lane was named after that uncelebrated woman. The plaque installed beneath a young pear tree. My niece, now in her teens, stood beside me and read the little line aloud. Her voice steady. She had been a child of Van Nights and bakery rooftops. Yes, but also of an orchard that would bear fruit for a long time. A few weeks later, I received a phone call from my sister. She had returned, older, and quieter, and she asked to see the house. She told me she had lost everything her husband once promised could be bought. The tone of her voice was not apology exactly, but a fragile recognition that the scales had tipped in ways she had not anticipated. She asked if she could come by. I thought of all the ways people beg for a second chance and all the economies of blame that had been spent on us. I thought of my mother's hands, of the hum of the kettle on winter mornings, of the orchard's first thin pears. I told my sister she could come for tea, but only if she brought with her the willingness to listen. She arrived with a small plant in a chipped pot and spoke haltingly about mistakes and learning. I listened and told her what had been most important, that my niece had been safe, that the house had found a new life, and that sometimes justice is not a hammer but a slow, stubborn reclaiming of ordinary things. She stayed for an hour. She kissed my niece's head like someone apologizing to a weathered coat. She left with a promise to rebuild bridges if she could. Whether she kept that promise was irrelevant that afternoon. The conversation itself was a small, necessary fracture mended by honest breath. If there is a punchline here, it is not theatrical. It is not a moment of grand revenge. It is that when someone tries to erase you, the best response is often to reappear, quieter but more resourceful, and to build a life that reframes their small victories as the transient arrogance they were. My sister lost a house she had tried to take by bending truth. But the community gained a space. My niece grew with access and opportunity. We all bore scars. Years after the legal battles, when I sit on the bungalow's porch with a cup of tea, I sometimes watch people walk the small lane named after an unassuming woman whose acts of kindness were not meant for plaques. I think of how the sound of children's laughter fits into the frame of justice more soothingly than any courtroom verdict. I do not celebrate my sister's misfortunes. I only recount a fact. Those who tried to make our story vanish were outwitted not by cruelty but by persistence. By the slow, exacting work of proof. By neighbors who remembered and by one developer who listened. When the pear tree first bore fruit, my niece climbed onto the old swing and drank the juice with sticky fingers. She looked at me and said, as only a child can, that everything was like a story now. I told her stories were living things. Sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, and that our job was to tend them. They had lied to the immigration office and to the court, thinking their version of events would hold. Instead, they created a narrative that kept unspooling. In the end, the truth, like sun through the new orchard, found its way into the places they thought they had sealed off.